Good afternoon, and welcome to IAB There, our regular streaming show in which we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. My name is Angelina Ang. I am the Vice President of IAB's Measurement and Attribution at IAB's Programmatic and Data Center. Today, I'll be joined by our guests from IAB's AI Standards Working Group. Early this week, the working group published Understanding Bias in AI for Marketing, a comprehensive guide to avoiding negative consequences with artificial intelligence, our second guide released in 2021. For a copy of it, you can go to iab.com and find the guide. This guide was a group effort from several AI and machine thought leaders and expert tech practitioners from top publishers, ad agencies, and ad tech companies, including Alliant, Dentsu, Emoto, IBM Watson Advertising, IP on Web, and Loeb & Loeb and Viacom CBS. We collaborated together to produce the paper to provide insight for the business executives, technologists, legal and compliance officers, and platform users to understand their responsibilities in process development, deployment, and ongoing management of an AI-driven solution. Let's introduce our guest, Kathy Mulro-Petey of counsel at Loeb & Loeb, David Olesnevich, head of product, IBM Watson Advertising, and holds a chair seat at the AI Standards Working Group, and Troy Cunningham, head of information security, IP on Web. Hi, guys. How are you?
Hey,
how are you?
Hi.
Thank you for joining me. I know that we've worked on this paper for about 6 months, and it's been a pleasure to have you all in that group. So, Dave, let me start with you first, right? We did a paper previous to this around business use cases. Give people a little bit of background why we picked this particular topic.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great team effort by everybody involved here, and this is as you mentioned, the second part of the series. And so, there's not going to be less data in marketing and advertising, and there's not going to be less AI either. And really, to achieve scale in advertising with artificial intelligence, we need to have transparency. We need to build up trust, and part of that is understanding bias and how it enters into systems and how we can mitigate that. And so we all gravitated to this after the first paper. Thought it was a really great topic for us to be leaning in on, especially with some new regulations that are appearing across the world. And so, hands raised to get into this bias space, raise education levels, understanding, and how we can deploy better AI systems going forward.
And Kathy, you're of counsel at Loeb & Loeb, and those that don't know what of counsel means, can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. Of counsel means I am part of the Loeb & Loeb team. Of counsel is just somewhere in between an associate and a partner. Very often people from like myself who have been in-house and counseling clients in-house go to law firms and take an of counsel role.
Oh, great. And what kind of conversations are you having with your clients around AI, and especially with bias, and how, is there a big concern or are there things that they're looking in terms of information that they're looking for and how they can mitigate it?
Yeah, so we've seen an increased amount of regulation, as David said, in the AI area. The FTC issued a blog post in April of this year where it talked about fairness and equity and transparency and bias, and gave some great advice to companies who have AI systems of how to include those types of issues in their AI governance practices. We've also seen on the state level an increased interest as well as potential regulation in Colorado, Virginia, and California as they roll out the regulations to CPRA and the Colorado and Virginia new privacy laws on transparency in AI and the logic of AI. So what I talk to my clients about really is how do we include that from the beginning to the end in our process? In our AI governance process, how do we include that fairness, transparency, and equity along the road? And this paper really helps provide some guidance in that area.
And Troy, a little bit about IP on Web. I think most people when they hear IPR, they think of the actual company that first developed some of the earliest DSPs, helped to build out trading desks for several organizations. So AI and machine learning is definitely like an innate part of your organization. What is your role, and how and what are some of the challenges that you've seen in the space?
So my role specifically within Icon Web is obviously as head of security, right? Which is overarching over everything that we do is try to make sure that we actually add security within our architecture, security within the rest of our business, kind of drive compliance, not only for our own good, but also for the good of our, for the good of our clients, right? Because at the end of the day, we're huge pipelines. We're trying to make sure that we secure that, right? That what we're doing is safe for everyone. So that's my role. And then specifically how AI and ML kind of affect our workload. As you say, right, we have all this rich background of having built out a lot of some of the original ad tech, right, in the world. And with, a cookieless future, we're now looking like, okay, how do we optimize that further, right? It's not, how do we change things with the changing world of advertisement, and exploring more AI and ML applied to that specifically.
Now, I'm going to open up to the group. I want to touch on some of the main themes that we covered in the paper. The first one, I'll quote it: "To err is human. To err in a system is a choice. Choosing not to audit." What does that mean? Anyone want to take that on?
I mean, for me, I can talk about the err to err is human, right? Yeah, I think at the end of the day, right, AI and ML are just extensions of what we are, right, as people. Like, they're extensions about our ability to analyze data and to make decisions about it. And because it's just an extension of us, because it's just a tool, it means that, if we make mistakes with that tool, the mistakes are made. I think that's the fundamental thing which kind of underpins the paper and underpins kind of the approach to AI.
Yeah, I can add to that, Troy. So if you think about the diverse group that we have here on the panel today, but then also who contributed to this paper, we have understanding, or we've tried to share some understanding of all the roles of everybody who's producing an AI system. And throughout all of that, their unintentional and unwanted bias can enter a system. And so having a snapshot of the different players in the space, and even if you play a very specific role, being able to understand what the other players in your team are doing and how they're operating, so we can all have a better understanding of who does what and when, and where we can all look for these unintentional and unwanted biases and start to mitigate them. But I agree that there's places where humans introduce bias and it's unintentional, but humans and machines working together can help mitigate these biases.
Yeah, and to talk about some of the roles that we talked about, I think this time around we didn't go with job titles or specific job functions or roles, but we kind of grouped different people into categories. One was the requester, which is someone who is either an individual or a team that is helping to define business needs, or developing strategies, or has a vision of what that solution would look like. Then we had the builders, who are either the architects, the developers, the data scientists. What else? The end user, which is, I think, for most people who use AI platforms, they are the end user, right? So you think about DSPs, measurement platforms, and things like that. They have a role in this, right? And as well as legal and compliance. And I think what was interesting was involving the consumer into this perspective, because at the end of the day, looking at it from their view and what their reactions would be. And the consumer could be not only a regular consumer that purchased stuff, but also government officials, the trades, journalists, and so forth. But Kathy, can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the role of legal and compliance, and how the other groups should be interacting with them during this process?
So legal and compliance, I would advise everyone that we start at the beginning, at the initiation phase, and you bring your legal compliance groups in all the way to the end, to the optimization and testing phase. And the role really should be as an advisor all along, to make sure They think through the regulatory impacts, the data privacy impacts, as well as the potential litigation impacts as you develop AI. So it not only are regulators looking at AI for certain reasons. Right now, plaintiffs' attorneys are also looking at AI technology, and we need to make sure that you're not discriminating or violating laws in a way that a plaintiff's counsel would then bring an action against you. We're there to counsel everyone. We're part of a team, and it should be, as Dave had said before, a really large team of different people with different groups and different opinions, so we can eradicate bias or negative bias in the ways that we want to.
Totally agree with that. I think like one of the things that I really liked about this paper and with working with you guys on this paper is the kind of the life cycle analysis approach that it's taken, you know. And I think this paper, and maybe this time, like in history right now, is where people are starting to think about AI less as technology that's coming in the future and more as technology that's now. And the thing that's changing is that it's not just technology, right? Like this is the thing, like thinking about AI is all of these other things. It is the governance, it is this data, because that actually has all these impacts. I think it's, yeah, I totally agree with what you said.
And I think it creates, it also creates some sort of culture within the, right? So if you're an AI driven organization, that has to resonate across the entire organization and have people follow guidelines or provide input and you know, really how to tell stories based on the data that they have. Dave, now, you know, you earlier talked about unintended bias. So, you know, one of the themes was AI is not inherently biased. Why is it not inherently biased?
It's the humans that bring the biases into the AI systems, and it is unintentional, you know. And so you as an organization may have stood up an AI system to achieve, you know, preferred business results, and in doing so, your teams could have introduced biases into those systems, and you know, as you're thinking about how those biases impact not only the results that you're ultimately trying to achieve, but then you get into the space where Kathy got to one end of it, where we're talking about lawsuits, but you know, building up the trust with your consumers, building up your trust with the advertising industry. I mean, I think if we're looking at doing what's right for the industry, mitigating unwanted biases that could have societal outcomes is it's super important for us to think about going forward. It's not just the business outcomes that we're trying to improve; it's the societal outcomes as well.
Yeah, and I think if there's any negative consequences, I don't think any company would want any negative consequences, right? Or they don't want negative consequences, and I think, right. And it's and what I loved about the paper is that we actually go from phase to phase with the series of checklists. What are some of the inputs that you need? What are the outputs that you need to produce? And what are some of the questions that you should be asking yourself as well as with your group? We talked a lot about like group dynamics. Troy, can you talk about how, you know, does some of what we cover in the paper resonate with your organization and how you think about things?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think we're at the starting point of trying to implement more of that. But that has also resonated with, it's not just this organization, but any organization that I've worked with that has taken that seriously. So like, I've worked with other data science companies, and it's very much, you know, the same kind of process, is really thinking through and being aware. And I think that just means any organization, whether they're going to do data science or whether they're going to do AI and ML, like that kind of awareness is what you need to drive that throughout.
Now, the third thing we talked about was unwanted outcomes can cascade. Can anyone give any examples of what that means? I'm assuming that what it might not, typically there's not just one issue, and that there are other consequences and other impact, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, Kathy.
So unwanted consequences can cascade because you may be wanting to advertise to a certain for a certain company for a tech job, and if you have data sets that are historically biased, you may not get that group in your audience for advertisement where you're actually getting to where your client needs, but you also have unwanted consequences that it could be discriminatory under state and federal regulations, as well as a reputational issue for your company. Like no one really wants to advertise for certain groups and really prohibit certain groups from applying to certain jobs. You know, we all are trying to do the right thing. We're all trying to do more good than harm. And I think that's what you need to think about as you go through the unwanted consequences. The FTC statement, do more good than harm, has been repeated in a lot of different bias guidelines as well as ours.
Anyone? Go ahead, Jerry.
I think like, let's take what could be a specific example, right? Like, let's say you want to do some better targeting over, maybe you're selling life insurance, which is something that is good for everyone, or maybe some medical insurance, right? And because of the data that you have, right, that you input into your system, really you're picking people who are doing a certain kind of shopping in a few places, but it ends up that maybe that is mostly male, right? Or it's mostly some section. And then by proxy of doing this and saying, hey, you know what, actually it's these people who are doing this buying on this site, which is really saying, hey, maybe these are the people we can target for ads, right? And then you end up not offering life insurance to a whole section of women, right? And that is just one potential example. And I'm sure this kind of thing actually happens way more often than we would like. But that is that kind of cascading effect. And then you can go down, further down. It's like, hey, maybe you fix it a little bit, but actually, are you offering it up to, or are you not offering or targeting ads to people of different races or different, I don't know, whatever, different areas of the country, whatever. There could be so many other cascading effects of that, but that's just the tip. And that's where you kind of like, I don't know, but where you got to start, right?
Yeah, I think if diving into the paper, it has a number of different type of biases identified and easy to consume formats so that you can understand the different types of biases, their impacts that they could potentially have. So I think it's a good guide for everybody to consume.
We also have checklists at the end of each section that are helpful to everyone to think about implementing in their organizations as sort of guidance as part of their AI sort of governance processes. And we hope these help everyone as they go forward, especially on the testing side. There's a lot of different sort of advice that I think is new and interesting and not necessarily always promoted, that there are testing groups that can actually help you.
Yeah, go ahead, Angie.
And I was going to say that, there's definitely been a lot of conversations out there around how AI is going to be even more helpful and used more when the deprecation of cookies come out. Do any of you think that with, there's talks of less data signals or less inputs or more fragmented walled gardens, kind of, where it's going to be a lot harder to do multi-touch attribution? What are your thoughts in terms of what's AI's role, especially in a post-cookie world?
I feel like I could.
Yeah, we could spend hours on this. Troy,
I could spin wheels. There's a lot of ways you can go, and I think it's really actually a tough question, right? Because there's two directions things are really going in, right? Which is like absolutely cookieless, identityless, right? Not just cookieless, but we just don't know who you are, which means you're talking about probabilistic patterns, which is an interesting use for AI, and it can get messy really quickly, right? Because then you have very little data, which makes it really hard to work out your biases in AI, right? Or you go the direction of first-party identities, right? Which you have maybe a lot of data, but maybe it's not applied correctly. And where AI could be probably easier to use, actually, because at least you have some real-world anchor that can be used, some first-party data that can be used.
Yeah, based on what I'm seeing in the marketplace, there's tons of different resources in terms of looking at how to actually do media mix modeling, right? And that it's not the end of the world. Advertising is going to continue. It just might be a little bit messy in the first year or two, but I think that there are ways that we'll be able to target and measure audiences. But I love like some of the creative, it's not just advertising, but it's also from the marketing standpoint, personalizing website experiences and offers and things like that, both offline and online. But Dave, what would you like people to get out of this paper? Like what is one thing that you want them to come away with after reading this?
Yeah, this is a starting point. I mean, not everybody is mature in their AI practices. And so if you take this and use it as a way to get started, a way to bring your teams together, a way to think about everything you need to consider when you're developing for the future, this is a great place to get started. And we all plan to build upon this going forward. But if you have a baseline understanding the different roles and responsibilities, the cycles, the types of biases, and the way you can start to mitigate unwanted biases, it's a great way to get started. And so I encourage everybody to dig into this and share with colleagues as well, especially those who you're going to be working closely with going forward. And we talked about just a moment ago about the identifierless future, or the uncertainty of that, and the testing and learning. This is all part of the testing and learning cycle. You have to build time into your workflows and into your roadmaps for testing and learning and exploring new technologies and new capabilities. And I think that this is all part of that going forward process.
Kathy?
I couldn't agree more with what Dave said. I think this is a great paper to share with your colleagues, to create work groups within your organizations, to make sure as you test new technologies, which I'm seeing my clients do in the advertising space, to test them as they use different data as we change to a cookieless world, and make sure that you eradicate bias from those new technologies that you're using, or augmented technologies.
And Troy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with what everyone said. This is a great starting point. It is that basis to go forward. I think if I could underpin something like that, for me, sings throughout the whole thing, is just use this as a guide to be transparent to yourself, to your organization, to your project team, but then also to your end users and potentially to your consumers about what you're doing. Because if you can be transparent about your AI, it means that you understand it pretty well. And it means that when regulation comes, as the regulation is coming and starts to get tougher, you will also be in a good position to measure that risk and to respond to it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and my thoughts would be that I think that this is not just for technology companies. It's not just for the developers and engineers. I think that if you are an end user, someone that uses AI, or a business leader, this paper really helps the entire organization think about it collectively as a group. And I think that's the main point, is that this is a collaborative effort, and that this cannot be, the responsibility is not just one team, and it is really not only with one organization, right? That as an industry, we need to set the practices in place so that things like increasing consumer trust and enabling that is there. But
Angie, I would add to that if you are a user of AI and you're a brand, that this is a great paper to help you talk through these issues with your service providers. It will help you think through how their use of AI could impact your brand going forward.
well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. And thank you for those watching. Please continue to watch IAB There, so our weekly show. Thanks, everyone.